Hello, class! I hope this message finds you happy, healthy, safe, and sound. Today we're going to learn about the U.S. national debt, which is under the chapter of domestic policy. And what we want to cover today is most likely going to shock you and hopefully not make you too sad because there are some harsh realities about the United States and our debt that most people don't know. And so I want to go into that and look at potential solutions so that we don't have to be sad about the current state of things because there is possibility for change. And okay, so if we're going to jump into this, first and foremost, let's get right to the numbers, okay? So what we're going to look at first to give you all a perspective on how much the United States owes. And when I say that, what we're referring to when we say the United States government debt is all of the money that everyone in the United States owes, public and private debts accumulated, and that number is currently, and I'm rounding a slight bit, $26.5 trillion. So if you want to write something down as your first number of the day, $26.5 trillion is the amount of the United States debt. That's how much we owe as a country. So then you're probably going to ask, who do we owe it to? How do we borrow it? All of these questions we're going to get to. But the second number I want you to see right away is our GDP, which stands for Gross Domestic Product. So how much we owe? $26.5 trillion. How much we're worth per year this year, meaning the GDP of the United States, rounding a slight bit again, is $20 trillion. Okay, so here's the good news. If you're writing down gross domestic product and you don't know what it means that that is how much the United States has produced, how much we're worth collectively that year. So for this year, the figures are looking right about $20 trillion so far that the U.S. economy has produced. That's incredible. That's, just to give you perspective, all of the European Union combined. Think about how much that is. Okay. The United States is significantly wealthier than China by about $6 to $7 trillion. But that number can and will change. And China, and we'll learn this, is one of the people lending us money. So right now they might have a smaller economy and have less than us in terms of GDP. But they also have less debt. So we have a bigger GDP, we're worth more, we're richer. We're the richest country on earth based on GDP. It's not even close. Not even within 2 or 3 trillion. So the US is the economic superpower of the world. It's not just my opinion, it's just the facts. It's just the numbers, right? So if we're the United States is the economic beast of the world, if you will, then how is it possible that we have $26.5 trillion in debt? And the answer is complicated, but the simple start to the answer is because we are so rich, we can afford this much debt for a time. And how do I know we can afford it? Well, we're doing it right now. How long can this last? How much can we continue to borrow? That's going to be a tough question to answer. And think about this. How long will people lend us money? So let's get into, there's so many questions to answer. But the first two that we're coming to are, why is there $26.5 trillion in debt when our country's GDP is only 20 trillion? So if you want to put that just into percentages, in the year 2000, our GDP, how much we were worth, to the ratio of how much we owed was 58%. So let me put it this way. Of our GDP, 58% of that GDP in the year 2000, about 58% or 60%, right in there, was debt. Now, how much of our GDP today is debt? It's over 130%. So what are we saying? We owe more than we're worth. The United States owes more than we're worth. So let's get into the big questions. How is this possible? How do we lend the money? And eventually, how do we get out of this situation? Is there a way out? Okay, so the first thing I just want to reiterate is that the reason this is even possible is because when you have an economy the size of the United States with a GDP that's the biggest in the history of the world since it's been recorded, then we have the United States has a little bit of latitude to be able to borrow, actually a lot of latitude, whereas poorer countries wouldn't be able to because the people lending to them might think, well, we might not ever get the money back. And at this rate, they might be thinking the same about the United States. Okay, but here's what you need to know. First and foremost, how do we lend money? How do we borrow money? How does that all work? Okay, so in order to learn that, I'm going to teach you all about it's not a branch of government, although some people would argue it's as powerful as one, but it is a subset of Congress, and it is the central bank of the United States, and that bank is called the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve. So there are smaller Federal Reserves, regional, around the country, but the ultimate Federal Reserve that we're talking about has somebody who's been appointed by the president and confirmed by the Senate. Remember that whole deal? Okay, so they get several years, and then they would potentially come back for one more round. But who's running the Fed, and what is it? Because I thought, Professor B, that Congress was in charge of the money. They are. But in the 19 teens, they decided we're going to create a bank to oversee all banks. And this bank is going to be the U.S. Central Bank. And what it's going to be in charge of is printing money. And here's some really big ones. You ready? Printing money is already huge. Not just because it's cool that someone gets to do it. But the Federal Reserve can and has done this. They've taken literally blank sheets of paper and just printed hundreds of billions of dollars. You might say, that's awesome. That's a great way to get rid of our debt. Just print out the money and pay people back with that. Why can't you do that? And the answer is not really because you're cheating. If the money worked, there wouldn't be any cheating involved. But if you just print money, if you just print it for no reason in large quantities, something happens, and it'll happen to every culture, to every society, in every place in the world. It is inescapable. It is like gravity, and that is called inflation. So it's happened in Zimbabwe more recently. It happened in Germany pre-Hitler, where the inflation got so bad that people were actually burning their money as a replacement for going to buy firewood. In Zimbabwe, people were using their money as toilet paper because it was cheaper than actually buying toilet paper. I had a friend, a professor of mine, who went to Zimbabwe during their economic crisis, massive inflation, and she brought back a receipt from like a Subway type shop. She had gotten a sub or sandwich and a bottle of water, and her bill was $1 million. Yes, you heard that right, $1 million. So what are we saying? When any country, anywhere, at any time, just starts printing money, printing money, and put it into the currency of the country, what that does is it dilutes the value of the currency already in the country. So you have a stable amount of money, and then you're like, well, I have debt, so we're just going to print. And you start printing money and putting that money into circulation. What's going to happen is what happened in every other place on Earth, in all of human history, that gravity comes in, that inflation, that invisible force that you can't trick. No government, no person can trick it. So the Federal Reserve has a very dangerous responsibility, I would argue. Printing money is dangerous. Why? Because if you do too much of it to try to deal with the situation, now if we know that, and that's a principle, why would governments ever just print a lot of money now that we know that it doesn't work? Well, they might be doing it as a temporary relief program, not trying to promote inflation. They're just trying to get more money into circulation so that more people have access to it. And then that might look like in the United States, like loans are easier to get, interest rates go down. And so that leads me to the next thing that the Federal Reserve can do. So they can print money, which could potentially lead to inflation. If it's not done exactly, calibrated exactly right, it could have bad effects on inflation. And then the next thing the Federal Reserve does is they set the interest rates. This is huge because after 9/11, the interest rate went down to 0.5%, 0.5%. We're back at that rate now where you've seen in history before interest rates as high as 8 or 9%. You might say, what does this mean, Professor V? You're losing me. Okay, right now, just think about this. You go buy a car and you don't have money for the whole car. You don't have $30,000. So you borrow some money. Who are you borrowing it from? Well, you go to the car agency and you sign out, and you're signing that you're borrowing money at a certain interest rate, right? If that interest rate is 0.5%, how are you feeling about buying that car? Amazing. Because if your credit's good and you got a 0.5 interest rate, that's a joke. That's not even 1%. That's, hey, I'll take that. But if you have a 9% interest rate on a $30,000 car, my math isn't that good, you're going to have several $1,000s of interest that you're paying just to have the car now. And they're lending you the money all along as you pay it back until it's fully paid, right? So interest rates do matter. Your credit card, you go out and spend some money, and then you have to pay it back at the end of the month, and you realize, oh man, my interest rate is 20, 15, 30%, whatever it is. That's just money it's like burning money, isn't it? It feels like if you've ever paid interest payments, student payments, whatever, and there's interest, it just feels like you're burning money. It's the cost you're paying to borrow it, right? So interest rates, the government, the Federal Reserve is in charge of lowering them or hiring them. So why would they ever put them up? Why would they ever go up? Why would they ever force people to pay more interest? The reason is because if inflation is really, really bad, that's one of the only ways to combat it, is to put the interest rates up. Why? Because the idea is the interest rates, as they go up, are going to make less and less, as the interest rates go up, less and less people are going to be able to afford to borrow. Because they can pay 0.5%, but they can't pay 9% interest, right? Does that make sense? So one of the only ways to stop inflation is to raise interest rates through the Federal Reserve. The Federal Reserve is also in charge of printing money that could cause inflation. So they can cause it and they can solve it. Hopefully they won't cause it in the first place, right? But just if you want one more, if you want a definition of inflation, first you could just say the value of your dollar going down. The value of your dollar going down. So if you want to put it a different way, you're going to have to spend more money to get the same thing. So if the inflation goes up from today to yesterday you bought a Diet Coke for $2. Today the Diet Coke's $4. That doesn't happen overnight usually, right? And we listed some extreme cases where it might, like Zimbabwe and Germany, but usually doesn't happen overnight. Usually it's a gradual thing where your grandmother, granddad, whatever, they went to the movie theater for $1, and we all know that story, and now it's like $40, right? If movie theaters open back up again. So interest rates are important, and they affect everyone's life that's spending money, or especially borrowing money, right? Okay, so we've got this idea of the Federal Reserve being the U.S.'s central bank that's in charge, and they do other things, but for what you need to know, you need to know that they print money, and which means they're essentially in charge of inflation. And then they set interest rates, which is going to decide, is there less money available in the economy as interest rates go up? It's less and less available to poorer people, right? It's just out of reach for them. But that will bring down inflation. That's the good news. So here's the bad news. You can't simultaneously bring down inflation and interest rates. It's one or the other. Don't ask me why. Go ask your economist. But in all seriousness, that's what you need to understand. At least it's like they're pulling different levers, and as the interest rates go up, inflation goes down, or as interest rates go down, inflation goes up. Why? Because now anyone can borrow money just about, because there's virtually no interest. So now there's money circulating in the economy again, which is what leads to inflation. Over circulation of money. Okay, awesome. You guys got it. We're ready. Y'all, as they say. Next, we're going to look at a major problem and how to fix it. So the major problem was $26.5 trillion in debt. Let me just tell you that when I taught this same class back in last semester, same everything, it was 23 trillion. One semester ago, the debt was 23 trillion, and now it's 26.5 trillion. I don't even know what $1 trillion looks like. None of us do. If it was sitting on a table, it would be the biggest table we've ever seen, right? It's an enormous amount of money. And so this is where we're really going to get into how are we able to do this? Why is this happening? What can we do to fix it? Okay, so how did it first, just really quickly, how did it leap from 23 trillion to 26.5 trillion since like your last class before summer? The answer is coronavirus. The answer is that the U.S. Congress spent the most money it's ever spent in the history of the United States, inflation accounted for. They spent the most money they've ever spent on a bill trying to bring the economy back. So if you got a check, or if you're getting unemployment, or if there's other things, that's where that $3.5 trillion is, about $3 trillion the Congress spent that they didn't have. Who else doesn't have it? Our country doesn't have it, right? If Congress doesn't have the money, then we don't have the money as the federal government, because they're in charge of it, right? Yes, they delegate those powers that we just talked about to the Federal Reserve, but at the end of the day, here's what we're going to get into. So we're going to look at four things that you need to know that are factors that contribute to the debt. This $26.5 trillion debt, let's get right to number one. Number one reason we have, and this is in no particular order on the test, I don't mind which order you go in as long as you know them. Number one reason we have this $26.5 trillion debt is because of something called budget deficits. Budget deficits. It's not as boring as it sounds. A budget deficit is simply this. It's spending more money that year than you have. How can you spend more money than you have, Professor V? You don't have the money. You're borrowing. Whatever you borrow that year is your budget deficit. You and I might have a budget deficit. It's not fun. I hope we don't, but the government does. So on average years before the virus and all this, we were looking at $500 to $600 billion a year. Just think about this. About $500 to $600 billion a year over the last 20 years. Every year that the government spends on things it doesn't have the money to pay for. What? Yes. So you go back 20 years and you're averaging out almost $600 billion a year budget deficit next year, budget deficit. So you add up let's just make it simpler for the math. You add up $500 billion twice. 2 years, 1 year we have $500 billion deficit, then the next year we have it again. What did we just add to our debt in 2 years? $1 trillion, right? Do you see how that works? So every year the Congress is borrowing money that it doesn't have to pay for stuff. And that budget deficit adds up every year over and over and over, unless in a year of surplus, say, where you have extra, which is unbelievably rare, you save or do something. But the last time we had a surplus in the United States, and I'm not taking a position on this, but President Clinton was president with a Republican Congress, so it was probably a little bit of both parties. And it was a huge deal. The whole country was like, oh my goodness, we've balanced the budget. And if you just want to write that term down, balance the budget, that's a solution to number one. Budget deficit. What's the solution? Budget deficit means you're spending money you don't have. What's the solution to that? Well, you write a budget for money, stuff that you do have, and you don't spend any more than that. And if you want other stuff, you can't borrow to pay for it. You just have to pay for it with what you have. That's a balanced budget. The U.S. has had that in 1996 with Bill Clinton and Newt Gingrich and the Republican Congress. But my point is, the number one on our list, the balanced budget or budget deficit has not been balanced even for 1 year since the 90s. So if every year we're adding 500, 600, 700, $1 trillion to the deficit every year, of deficit to the debt every year, can you guys see how a debt that was in 2007, you're going to watch this little video, IOUSA, a little documentary. In 2007, I know it seems so long ago, right? When I started teaching in college, I showed this, and the national debt at that time was less than $9 trillion. And it was actually about 2008 by that time. So 2007, 2008, the debt is $9 trillion. 2020, 26.5 trillion. So number one on our list, remember, budget deficits are leading to that. We're spending more money every year that we don't have, and we're borrowing that money. How do we borrow it? Now we're going to go back to the Federal Reserve for a second. There's one more thing that they can do. For our purposes, they can do more than this, but this is what we need to know. They can issue bonds. A bond is really simply an IOU. It's like a check from the government that you won't cash for a given number of years, okay? And so, for example, if you get a $10 savings bond today and you buy it from the US government, why would you do that? Well, maybe you want to make money 10 years from now and you're going to get interest off of them. But the government needs money now. So they're willing to give you interest in 10 years to get your money now. So China knows that, and a lot of countries know that, and a lot of investors know that, and say, okay, fine, I'll invest, I'll buy bonds from you. That's how we lend money, just so you know. The U.S. lends money, if you're asked on the test. How do we lend money? We lend money through the issuing of bonds. A bond is an IOU. I got one when I was like 10 years old, and I just remember thinking, oh my gosh, a $10 bill, I can go spend it. And then it's like, no, son, this is a savings bond. You're going to spend it in 10 years and it'll be worth $15. And I'm like, 10 years, that's forever. But if you're doing it as a major investment, you buy bonds from another country. So what are you doing? You're lending them money. I'm buying it from you. I'm buying what? An IOU. You're not giving me anything right now. You're just going to pay me interest in the future. So that might lead you to this next question. If China is one of the major buyers of our bonds, why don't they just cash all the bonds in right now so that they can like almost own America practically? Or what would happen, it would be devastating to the U.S. national economy because we couldn't pay it. We don't have the money to pay it. Can't borrow money to pay back borrowed money. So you might ask yourself, wow, why doesn't China do that? If we're the largest economy and they're pretty far behind, why don't they just be like, IOUs, cash in right now. Here are your bonds. I want my money. And here's the good news. The answer is China is not going to do that anytime soon, because if they shot us in the foot, so to speak, they would be shooting themselves in the other foot. Meaning, if they crash the U.S. economy by demanding their bond, their money back, the U.S. economy would be devastated and wouldn't be able to buy all the Chinese goods that the U.S. economy regularly buys. So by crushing the US economy, China would be crushing its own economy. So right now, keep your friends close, keep your enemy. I mean, whatever you want to say. I don't know that China is an enemy of the United States. I don't think that they are in terms of the government, although Trump's rhetoric may make you think otherwise. I'm not going to comment on that. But while we may not be enemies with China, there's certainly a competition, right? Like, there's always going to be among world superpowers of, who's the greatest, the strongest, the safest. We're doing military exercises. The U.S. is right now military exercises off of I believe it's the South China Sea. So they're not our best friends. We don't go do military exercises around Canada and our other allies. Like, we don't do that, right? It's not so. The show of power against China, just even today, is really to be fair. It's something that we really do need to talk about in terms of, do we really trust China as a government? Does the government of China trust our government? Probably not. Now, why does that matter? It matters because here's the good news. There's almost no chance the US is going to go to war with China, right? But there is a very good chance that there could be an economic type of war. So here's what that would look like. If the United States decided to go to war in a country where China didn't want us to go, or if the United States decided to get into a treaty that China didn't want us to be involved in, anything like that, if China says, don't go into that treaty, don't do that thing that you're about to do, United States. If you do that thing, we will make you pay up all of your money. All of your IOUs we're going to cash in right now. So could China do that? Could China say, because realistically, guys, we're not going to, we're not going to fight. We're not going to have a military battle with China, partly because the US is smart and they know that there's 4 times the population in China, partly because the whole world is smart that we don't want a world war, right? So if China wanted to make the US do something without fighting us, could they do it? And the answer is yes, because they have this leverage over us. Because we owe them so much money, they could say, don't go do this, US. If you go do this, we'll cash in and that threat could be there. It hasn't been used yet, but it's been used in history by the United States towards Great Britain. The United States didn't want them involved in the Falkland Islands, and they were saying get out, and the English and French didn't really want to get out. And so the US in the 1950s said, we bought a lot of your IOUs, we bought a lot of your bonds, you owe us a lot of money, we own a lot of your debt. You leave and take your troops home, or we're going to cash in right now. We said that to our friends, allies. Imagine how much someone who isn't an ally would be able to say that if they really wanted to. Does that make sense? So we coerced England to stop what they were doing based on economic warfare, basically, or the threat of economic warfare. That's all China would have to do to change our behavior if and when it ever comes to that. So I would say this about us borrowing money, borrowing money and issuing bonds, that China is taking its time and biding its time, and I would say being extremely wise and pragmatic in how they're like looking at the future in terms of, okay, where is it going to be? Yes, the US is the superpower now, but maybe we can get there someday. So I view China's role as like, they're not going to just try to jump in tomorrow and start a war with the US, economic or otherwise, because they need our economy. We buy all their stuff. But there's just eventually going to be, potentially, a separation where China sort of weans itself off of needing the US's constant purchasing, so that they would be able to, say, hey, you owe us the money now. Because they're not going to ask for the money back when they're shooting themselves in the foot at the same time they're shooting us in the foot, if that makes sense. No literal shooting, we're just talking economically speaking. Okay, so that was a long explanation for, number one, budget deficits, and how do we borrow that money for those deficits? Through bonds, which are issued by the Federal Reserve, that bank that also does interest rates and printing the money. Excellent. Okay, so number 2, let's keep going. We have a trade deficit. The United States, so the 4 things we're listing are basically what are the 4 factors that lead to this $26.5 trillion debt. Okay, so the second one is a trade deficit. And what you need to know about this is that the United States is been last in the world when it comes to trade deficit. Deficit is just a simple way of saying you lack something. So if there's a deficit in trade, the US is lacking something. What are we lacking? Well, trade usually looks like this. There's only really 2 things, right? You can import stuff and you can export stuff. You can bring stuff into your country and you can ship stuff out and sell it. What do you want to do more of? Well, you're probably going to want to export more so that people around the world will buy your goods. But if the US, which we are, is importing way more than we're exporting, like my hand signals, if we're importing way more than we're exporting, then we have a trade deficit. And of course, the United States is known for liking our purchases. We like to buy stuff. And so we are a consumer economy mostly. And so that means that, and here's some other factors behind that. Why is the trade deficit so bad? Why is the US in last place? If we were in last place in basketball or anything else, or I don't know, no one likes soccer other than me in America, but if we were last in American football somehow, well, we're the only ones that play it, so that doesn't make sense. We wouldn't tolerate being last in much. In other words, as Americans, there's not much tolerance for being last, but with the trade deficit, last place has been our resting place. And the reason is, and this is important to understand, there's another reason, and one of the reasons is actually, I would argue, a good reason. And what I mean is, in the United States, how come we can't just make stuff here so we don't have to get everything made in China? And the answer is we can make stuff here, but it's really expensive compared to making it in China. You already knew that. But what I would say the good part is the why. Why is it more expensive in the US? And that's, I would argue that there's a good reason for it. You may not agree with unions and everything they do, but the reason it's more expensive to make stuff in the US is because unions and other people fought for laws that protect US workers. So here's some protections that you and I have. Minimum wage. No one can make you work for less than a wage. You're not even allowed to work for less. They have to pay you a minimum wage, right? There are worker protections like taking breaks. There's protections like maternity and paternity leave, family leave. There's all types of different protections, workplace and otherwise, right? That make the cost of business more expensive. I have to pay my workers well in the US. That's a good thing. But the bad part about it is that in China, they don't necessarily have to play by the same rules. So if you're a burgeoning industry, which means you're blossoming, and you're just looking at making the most amount of money, which is a business sort of 101, then why would you make it in the US? It's just going to cost you 5 times as much. If you're just looking at money, you wouldn't make it in the US. You would make it elsewhere, probably in China, because unions aren't there, and there are very few universal protections for workers. So unlike in the US, where we have, you could go through your list of protections that workers have in our country that we just we take for granted. Like I said, taking breaks and getting paid a minimum wage and not having to work more than a certain number of hours without a break, and all these other rules, right? Getting paid overtime or after 40 hours. I mean, the government makes a lot of rules to protect workers in the US, whereas that's not necessarily the case in China. So, number 2 on our list, trade deficit. Does it make sense now why? The US is having a tough time exporting because it costs a lot of money to make stuff here. That's the bottom line. Number 3, savings deficit. Here's what you need to know. Not necessarily through fault of our own, but for the first time since the Great Depression era, the United States has been in a consistent savings deficit year after year, which means this. The average American is not saving money. Not only are they not saving money, they're going into debt. We already know that the first one is the US government goes into debt every year. Now we're talking about Americans not having enough to save, so that when they lose their job, they don't have a savings account, they have unemployment. That's what they need. And who pays for that? The government, right? Does that make sense? So that is a massive, massive problem that Americans either cannot save because they don't have enough money to save. There's just not no extra money to put away. Or there may be a group of people that can save, but they just don't want to. They just want to buy stuff. And then there's a group of people that can save and do. And that's probably what most people would call like the 1%, right? Not the middle class right now is not saving, and that's not necessarily, again, not necessarily their fault. But the reality is when the United States' savings are depleted, or any country, people's savings are depleted from that country, then when they go out of business or when they lose their job or when something catastrophic happens, they have no fallback now. They have to rely on the government money. So that puts us even more into debt. Does that make sense? So savings deficit is number 3. And number 4, this is where I get the most fired up. Number 4 is a leadership deficit. And I want you to just think about this question that I'm asking right now. How many politicians do you know by name that in your lifetime you can ever remember talking about the debt with numbers? With like, not just saying we need to tackle the debt, like bringing up the numbers of the debt, and not, they don't have to break it down in a lecture like me, but have you ever heard a politician in your lifetime say there's this much debt and this is what we should do about it? There are so few, I can count them on one hand. And I'm not going to go single people out for praise, but there was one Congress person, senator a few years ago, that when the debt was 19 trillion, this senator for Halloween wore a sweater and put the number 19 trillion on it, and saying that was the scariest. Other than that, you hear cursory, which means just, you know, like, oh yeah, we're going to tackle the debt from both parties. You hear it more from the Republican Party, but I'm not taking any side, just the facts are clear. Both parties are leading to the debt. The debt sometimes does actually go higher during Republican administrations. Some of that may, like during the Bush administration, may have been because of 9/11. We don't know how much of that was just because of the other policies separate from 9/11. But here's the leadership deficit in plain English. Ready? The average politician, and you tell me if I'm wrong, I would love to see the news of all the people that talk about it, but there's just not there. Politicians, generally speaking, don't bring up the issue of the debt. They don't bring it up to the public. And if you don't even bring it up to the public, how in the heck are we supposed to address it and fix it? So why wouldn't they bring it up? Well, the answer is kind of easy. If you're a new politician, you just got in town, you might be willing to bring it up more because you're new in DC and you're like, I haven't contributed to this debt. I'm here to fix it. But if you've been in DC for any amount of time at all, it may be viewed that you're the reason that this debt exists in the first place. So don't come to me and ask me to increase my taxes and cut my spending so that you can fix the problem that you created, Mr. Politician or Mrs. Politician, right? I mean, so the general feeling is from politicians, essentially, why would I bring this up to voters? Why would I bring this up? It's easier to just put a Band-Aid. Imagine you had cancer and you put a Band-Aid on it. That's not going to do anything. It might do one thing. It might make you feel better, like, okay, I've solved the problem. But you know you haven't really solved it. And politicians, I would argue, do something like that, right? They're putting a Band-Aid on cancer. The average American doesn't understand the economic cancer we're talking about right now of $26.5 trillion in debt, over $6 trillion more than our GDP we owe. Most people don't know that. And partly, no, I'd say mostly, it's because public officials, politicians, are not talking about it. And yes, there are other things going on in our country that are unbelievably important. Criminal justice reform, Black Lives Matter movement, COVID response. But we're talking like before all this, in peacetime and wartime, the debt is not something that leaders have. And here's how we know. Leaders have not gotten together and tackled this issue sufficiently. And we know that because we have $26.5 trillion in debt. And back in 2007, 2008, it was $9 trillion. So we're on course to just keep smashing records in terms of how much money we're borrowing. And this is what I would love to see from politicians. I hope you would too, is them talking about it, at least saying, like, I know that there's no one easy solution, but we have this massive debt, and if we don't start talking about it now, then by the time we do it, it'll be too late. Something like that. You don't hear that very often. Again, I can count on my hand the number of Congress people and senators that go out of their way to make the debt an issue and say, like, hey, let's resolve it. So here's the final thing about the leadership deficit that leads to this $26.5 trillion in debt. And the leadership deficit, I would say, is that there's been a lack of willing to compromise. And what I would highlight is like, imagine you go to the doctor and the doctor says, like, I hate to say this to you, but you need to lose some weight. And the doctor's telling you this for your own good, just objectively. Remember, this analogy is supposed to be the US economy, lose some of that debt, right? For our own health and our own security. So the doctor's telling you this, and he or she says, okay, you need to do two things regularly. And they're both difficult, and they're both going to take a lot of discipline, and you're probably not going to want to do either of them, but you got to do both. First thing you got to do, you got to exercise more. So increase how many calories you're burning. Go do the hard work of getting out of breath by running or whatever. And eat less. So not only am I working harder and I want more calories because I'm burning more, I don't get it. No. I work harder, I exercise, and I eat less. Dang. So now let's put that into plain English. That sounds hard. That sounds like I don't want to go to the gym. And guess what? That's exactly what taxes are like. Imagine this scenario. A Republican, Democrat leaders come to you and are honest, and they say, we have $26.5 trillion debt. Here's what we have to do to fix it, like a doctor is, just objectively. We're going to, wait for it, you ready? We're going to have to raise your taxes. So your taxes are going way up. And even though your taxes are going up, you're actually going to get less from the government for it, because we have to tax more and spend less at the same time. We have to exercise more and eat less. You can't just do one or the other. It won't be good enough. It won't work. You have to do both. So number 4, leaders, if you're out there listening, politicians, and those of you students who are future politicians, now you're equipped with the message. If leaders don't talk about this, it is never going to get fixed. If they don't address it and don't even bring it to the public's attention, and they leave it to political science professors, then we have a real problem, right? So if politicians will at least start talking about it, that's the first thing. The second thing is they're going to have to compromise. It's just going to really stink. If you're a Democrat or Republican, you're going to hate one of these. If you're a Republican, man, you're going to hate the fact that we're increasing taxes. If you're a Democrat, man, you're going to hate the fact that we're cutting government spending on programs you like. But the fact is, like, there's no other way to do it. You have to do both. And if there isn't a compromise and nothing ever happens and no one ever talks about it, ultimately we can be left in a situation where the debt just grows and grows and grows. And at some point, it may be 50 years or but at some point, China and maybe other countries as well could financially, economically overtake the United States. And it wouldn't be unthinkable. It's very realistic, and it's potentially very possible if the US doesn't change course. So here's what you do. You go out and you preach the message of our debt, and you vote for people who talk about it. It's none of my business who you vote for. But I think this last part we do have to say is that if voters hear politicians, let's say politicians hear my lecture and they go out and tell voters the truth, the cold hard truth about the debt. We're going to increase your taxes and cut your spending. I'm sorry. Is it possible that if they're that blunt, as I've been in this lecture, that the voters, us, will not vote them in? because they're like talking about the debt and all this horrible stuff. I don't want this person. Is that possible? Yes, it is possible. So politicians, and it's, I guess I'm giving them a little bit of an excuse, right? They're probably thinking, am I going to win an election by bringing this issue up? I'm only one person. I can't solve it myself, but I could lose an election myself over it, right? But because then you're associated with it potentially. So it doesn't excuse it, but it could give you a reason why a politician, a leader, wouldn't bring it up. It's because voters don't. Now, this is not including you all, but most voters don't know enough about the issue, and so they may end up punishing the messenger instead of, the people that were the ones doing these debt and deficit deals for the last 20, 30 years in Congress. So your assignment is to go preach the news of the debt, and hopefully, what will happen is that people, I don't care who you vote for, absolutely none of my business, but that the people that are on the ballot, whoever they are and whoever you're voting for, at least have a plan for the debt, at least talk about it, at least acknowledge it, right? Otherwise, if leaders aren't going to do that, it might be somewhere, on the ninth tab of the seventh page of their, campaign. But at least if it's on there, there's something. But if there's no acknowledgement of the debt, because I would assume that most Americans don't know that it's this high, or the implications of it, as you all now know. So this is a really important issue. I think it will probably be like many issues in American politics, that it'll be like a Band-Aid on cancer, that politicians have sort of, oh, everything's fine, we've got it taken care of, and then nothing's actually being addressed until the cancer starts to spread and there's real consequences in the economy worldwide and in the US. Hopefully that our politicians and our voters will demand a change, and the debt will be, they say, paid down. Eliminated would be great, but there's only been one time in U.S. history, I believe it was 1835, when the U.S. had no debt at all. Only 1 year in the U.S. history that we've had no debt. So it's kind of an American tradition, and I would argue that it's one that we might want to break for our own good. I will see you all soon. Go out and save. Don't spend too much money. I'm kidding. Do what you like. Just be safe. And until the next lecture, God bless, all the best. Professor V. See you soon.